December 6th, 1991, in Austin, Texas. Just before midnight, an officer on patrol notices something wrong. It's not just a light left on, it's a flicker, a glow that doesn't belong, and smoke is pouring from the roof of a local yogurt shop in an Austin strip mall called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. He calls it in. When firefighters force their way inside, they're met with a wall of intense heat and thick black smoke. They battle the blaze with heavy streams of water mixing with ash and debris, turning the small shop into a blackened, sodden mess. And as the smoke clears, they realize it isn't just a fire, it's a cover-up, something even worse. Homicide Detective John Jones was on call that night, and as he drove up to the scene, he wondered, why was he being called to a fire? However, once he stepped inside the burned-out shop, he would later describe the scene with two words: wholesale carnage. In the shop, he and his fellow officers discovered the bodies of 4 young girls. They were bound, shot, and horrifically burned. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was an atrocity, an act of such profound violence that it would steal the innocence of an entire city and launch a search for answers that would span more than 3 decades. Before we delve deeper into this tragic case, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. I know we were scheduled to cover a Great Lakes case this week, and we'll definitely be back with one next week. But when the news broke recently that the yogurt shop murders may have been finally solved, I knew we had to bump this one up. It's always extra difficult to cover cases where the victims are children, but the fact these families finally have answers, and others, as you'll see, finally have the shadow of suspicion 100% lifted from them, is a silver lining. Each time I hear of another cold case being solved, it gives me hope. Hope that soon, more grieving families will get long overdue answers and justice. In 1991, Austin was a city on the rise, but it still had what many called a small town feel. It was the kind of place where a crime this monstrous felt impossible. This horror was something that only ever happened in other cities. The murders shattered that illusion. Signs and billboards soon appeared across the city, asking a question that would haunt a generation. Who killed these girls? To understand the depth of this loss, you have to know just who they were. They weren't just victims, they were daughters, sisters, friends, with their lives full of promise. Jennifer Harbison was 17, a hard-working high school senior who worked at the yogurt shop to earn her own money. She was saving for college. Outside of work, she was part of the track team, raised sheep, and placed 8th nationally in floriculture in Future Farmers of America. Proof of her drive and her love for growing things. Her best friend and worker, Eliza Thomas, was also 17. Eliza shared Jennifer's love of animals and her dedication to FFA. She had just bought her first car with her hard-earned wages. Not a shiny new ride, but a dented green clunker that she adored. To her, it meant freedom, independence, and the thrill of finally steering her own life. That night, as they were closing up the shop, Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah had stopped by with her best friend Amy to get a ride home. Sarah Harbison was a high school freshman who loved sports, school clubs, and raising sheep with her sister. At just 13, Amy Ayers was the youngest, a teen who spent hours riding horses, raising pigs for FFA, and dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. Their family's memories paint a picture of a perfectly normal Friday night. Barbara Ayers Wilson, the mother of both Jennifer and Sarah, recalled how happy her daughters were that day. She hugged them both goodbye and told them to be careful. Eliza's younger sister Sonora, who was only 13 at the time, later spoke of the days she spent fantasizing that her big sister had somehow escaped and was just hiding, that she would eventually come back. And Amy's father, Bob, mourned all the moments that were stolen from him. Quote, "I lost my daughter. I lost my first dance. I won't see her graduate." And what happened inside that shop was a forensic nightmare. The fire had been so intense it melted jewelry and burned 3 of the girls beyond recognition. The water used to fight the blaze then washed away potential evidence, making things like fingerprinting nearly impossible, not to mention all the firefighters trampling all over the scene before they realized it was a murder scene. When homicide detective John Jones saw the mess of the scene, He knew he needed help. The FBI and the Texas Department of Public Safety were called in to provide that help. Eventually, investigators were able to piece together the following likely timeline. Shortly after 11 p.m., the front door had been locked while the four teens finished closing for the night. It seems likely that the murderers came in the back door, threatening them with a weapon. The girls had been bound with their own clothing and gagged in the back room of the store. They'd each been shot in the head, execution style, with a .22. However, the autopsies revealed that two different guns were used, which immediately suggested there was more than one killer. After the .22 bullet failed to kill Amy outright, another weapon, a .380, was used, and that one, sadly, was fatal. And in the midst of all this destruction, investigators made a crucial recovery. At least one of the girls had been SA'd, and from her body they collected a tiny sample of male DNA, the only piece of biological evidence to survive the inferno. After removing about $500 from the registers, the killer set a fire in the storage room where three of the girls were left. And for some unknown reason, Amy's body was found closer to the front of the store, as you can see here in this diagram. The scene itself was a disturbing contradiction. The methodical binding and execution of four victims pointed to a killer or killers who were organized and in complete control. Yet the arson was a frantic, chaotic act designed to wipe the slate clean. This strange combination of control and chaos led one of the original detectives to believe they were looking for an experienced adult criminal, not impulsive teenagers. With a compromised crime scene and few leads, the investigation began with a single and overwhelming question. Who could commit such a calculated and brutal crime, and why? In the weeks and months that followed, a wave of shock and fear washed over Austin. The pressure on the Austin Police Department was immense. A special task force was formed, and the FBI was called in to assist. But the case was drowning in a sea of false leads. The phone lines rang constantly with tips, hundreds of them. Late customers of the yogurt shop recalled several suspicious men who'd been at the yogurt shop that night after 8 p.m. One witness, security guard Daryl Croft, arrived to buy some yogurt at 10 p.m. and encountered a white man in his late 20s who kept letting other customers go first in line. Croft thought this behavior was strange, so when the man turned to him and offered to let him go first as well, Croft refused. Then the man went to the counter and only ordered a single can of pop before disappearing down a hallway. When Croft asked Eliza, the counter, where the man had gone, she said she'd let him use the restroom in the back. Again, feeling that something was off, Croft waited around for several minutes, but the man didn't come back out. Croft would later testify that man was around 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a long pointed nose. People theorize this individual might have jammed the back door in order to give himself access to the shop later. Other witnesses, a couple, recalled leaving around 11 p.m. when there were still two men sitting at a table inside. The woman said the way the two were acting made her uncomfortable. Defense lawyers later argued the man seen by Croft was probably one of these two people. One can only imagine the horror the witnesses must have felt later to realize that they were some of the last people to see the young girls alive. Bizarrely, the investigation was plagued by a flood of false confessions. For example, here's an article about a teenage couple who claimed to be responsible for the murders. They were quickly cleared, however, due to their inability to give any details of the crime. In total, over 50 people came forward to claim responsibility for the murders, including the notorious Texas serial killer Kenneth McDuff, who confessed on the very day of his own execution. Each confession, no matter how unlikely, had to be thoroughly investigated and debunked, which consumed thousands of hours of police time and led investigators down one dead-end path after another. Amidst this chaos, just days after the murders, a lead emerged that seemed promising. A 15-year-old boy named Maurice Pierce was arrested at the North Cross Mall, not far from the yogurt shop, for carrying a loaded .22 caliber pistol, one of the two weapon types used in the killings. Under questioning, Pierce didn't confess. Instead, he pointed fingers at his friend, 15-year-old Forrest Wellborn. Pierce spun a strange story, claiming that Wellborn had borrowed his gun on the night of the murders, and returned later, sweaty and smelling of hairspray, a potential accelerant for a fire. Wellborn, when brought in for his own investigation, denied any involvement, but for some reason, maybe thinking it would be an alibi, he admitted to taking a joyride to San Antonio, along with Pierce and two others, Michael Scott, 15, and Robert Springsteen, 17. Scott and Springsteen were subsequently brought in for questioning. Detective Jones and his team quickly concluded that Pierce was lying, and added to that, it didn't seem like the gun matched the bullets. Jones was also confident that Wellborn wasn't involved at all. Jones later reportedly said, quote, "Wellborn had no clue. He couldn't organize a two-car parade," end quote. With nothing to connect them to the crimes, all four teenagers were released. For 8 long years, the case went cold, and the files grew thicker, and the answers remained out of reach. The families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah were left in a state of limbo, grieving without closure. The lead detective, John Jones, was also haunted by the crime. He grew so close to the families that he made them a promise. He would hang on to the ugly neon green striped shirt he was wearing when he was first called to the murder site. But he swore he'd only wear it again when the mystery was finally solved. Then, in 1999, everything changed. With no new evidence, no new witnesses, and no new leads, new investigators aggressively turned their attention back to reviewing the case and the hundreds of tips that had been flowing in shortly after the murders. For some unknown reason, they focused on Maurice Pierce and his .22. A defense lawyer, Joe James Sawyer, later criticized this focus as an imbecilic way to review a cold case. Instead of reviewing all tips with an open mind, the lawyer argued that the investigators started with the premise that the earlier detectives had simply missed the bad guy who was hiding in the available clues, instead of digging deeper to see what clues and what potential suspects could have been missed. In the absence of physical proof, it seems the police became drawn to a compelling narrative that fit their preconceived theory, that a previously interviewed gang of troubled local youths were the perpetrators of this heinous crime. This story was easier to build a case around than the alternative, the ghost of an unknown but experienced killer who'd simply vanished without a trace. This shift in focus, a classic example of what experts call investigative tunnel vision, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most profound miscarriages of justice in Texas history. In September of 1999, the team of cold case detectives brought Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, now in their mid-20s, in for questioning. What followed weren't simple interviews. They were grueling, multi-day interrogation sessions designed to break them down. Michael Scott was questioned for a staggering 18 hours over a period of 4 days. Robert Springsteen would later describe the experience in stark terms. Quote, "I was berated and berated and berated by the police officers. Until they obtained what it was they wanted to hear, they weren't going to allow me to leave. Basically, they broke me down." End quote. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the controversial psychology of police interrogations. It might seem impossible that an innocent person would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit, let alone a quadruple murder. But research and hundreds of documented cases of wrongful convictions show it happens far more often than we think, and it's often the result of specific and highly coercive techniques. These can include outright intimidation, such as threatening suspects with the death penalty, or warning them of the violence they'll face in prison. During Michael Scott's interrogation, a detective was even photographed holding a gun to his head. Interrogators also use exhaustion and psychological stress to wear down a suspect's ability to think clearly and resist suggestion. Crucially, they often employ deception, lying about evidence they don't have. And perhaps most insidiously, they can be prone to investigator leakage, a process where detectives, intentionally or not, feed non-public details of the crime scene to the suspect. The suspect, then exhausted and desperate, incorporates these details into their story, making their confession sound incredibly authentic and convincing to outsiders. At the time, the Austin Police Department was notorious for these very tactics. It was known as the Polanco era, named after Sergeant Hector Polanco, an interrogator nicknamed the Cobra for his ability to elicit confessions. Polanco had cultivated a culture of intimidation, and it resulted in a string of false and coerced confessions in other major cases throughout the 90s. In a dark twist of irony, Polanco had briefly been the head of the original Yogurt Shop task force back in 1992, but was removed from the case after he was suspected of, you guessed it, eliciting a false confession. In fact, earlier in the case, one of the reasons that John Jones believed Maurice Pierce was telling the truth about his innocence was because even after being questioned by Polanco back in 1991, he hadn't confessed. Under this intense pressure, both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen finally broke. They gave shocking and detailed confessions, implicating not only themselves, but each other and their two friends, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn. To the police, these were the bombshells they'd been waiting for. The details seemed to match the crime scene. The cross implications seemed to lock the story together. In October of 1999, the Austin Police Department held a press conference to announce that 4 men had been arrested and charged with capital murder. Public and to the grieving families, it was the news they'd waited 8 years to hear. The case was finally solved. But as soon as the men were out of the interrogation rooms, they recanted everything, insisting they'd been coerced into confessing. And a critical problem remained. There still wasn't a single piece of physical evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapons, no hair, no fibers that connected any of the 4 men to the crime scene. This created a profound paradox. A confession is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in a courtroom. It feels like the ultimate admission of guilt. But the complete absence of any corroborating physical evidence made these confessions deeply suspicious. How could 4 people commit such a violent, bloody, and chaotic crime and leave behind absolutely no trace of their presence, only their words, extracted years later under extreme duress? The confessions were simultaneously the prosecution's entire case, and from a critical standpoint, the biggest red flag in the entire investigation. This led to a new and deeply unsettling mystery. The police had their confessions, and the men were facing the death penalty. But was this the long-awaited truth, or was it a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, built entirely on words spoken under unimaginable pressure? The cases against Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were eventually dropped due to a complete lack of confessions or evidence. This left Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott to face trial alone in 2001 and 2002, respectively. The prosecution's strategy was simple and direct. With no forensic evidence to present, their entire case rested on the power of those 2 recanted confessions. In court, they focused heavily on the horrific, emotional details of the crime, painting a picture of unimaginable brutality for the jury, and then presented the confessions as the only possible explanation. However, the way they used those confessions involved a fatal legal error. The prosecution's key tactic was to use excerpts from one man's confession as evidence in the trial against the other. For example, in Michael Scott's trial, they presented parts of Robert Springsteen's statement that implicated Scott. This might sound like a solid strategy, but it violated a cornerstone of the American legal system, the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause. Put simply, the Confrontation Clause guarantees every defendant the right to confront their accuser in court. Because Robert Springsteen didn't testify at Michael Scott's trial, and vice versa, their lawyers had no opportunity to cross-examine them on the stand. In this context, the confession itself became a kind of silent witness that couldn't be questioned or challenged. It was a clear constitutional violation that would years later become the basis for their appeals. But at that time, in the emotionally charged atmosphere of the courtroom, the graphic details of the confessions were enough. The juries, overwhelmed by the horror of the crime and presented with what seemed to be direct admissions of guilt, delivered their verdicts. Both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were found guilty of capital murder. Scott was sentenced to life in prison. Springsteen was sentenced to death. For the families, for the city of Austin, and for the police department, it seemed that justice, however long and painful the road had been, has finally arrived. The case was closed. But the constitutional flaw in the trials provided a legal opening. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Robert Springsteen's conviction, a decision upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Michael Scott's conviction was overturned soon after. Both men were granted new trials. This was like torture to the victims' families, who firmly believed that their daughter's murderers were getting away with it. As Maria Thomas told CBS News, quote, "I felt like my head was going to spin out of my body, and it was because their rights were violated. Each time I hear those words, that their rights were violated, I just feel like I'm going to go insane. I mean, I'm pretty angry, you know? Their rights are violated, our girls were murdered. End quote. The Travis County District Attorney, Rosemary Lemberg, also remained convinced of Scott and Springsteen's guilt and was determined to retry them. Quote, if you get to know these families and watch their strength, you want to find justice for them. End quote. But her case was now significantly weaker. The confessions could no longer be used against each other. She needed something more. She needed something concrete, something physical, something scientific. So the prosecution turned to the one piece of physical evidence that had been sitting in an evidence locker since 1991, that tiny sample of male DNA recovered from one of the victims. In the years since the first trials, technology had made incredible leaps. The prosecution was confident that a new, more advanced form of testing would finally provide the physical proof they needed, linking Scott and Springsteen to the crime scene beyond any doubt. They believed science was their ultimate weapon, the final nail in the coffin. They had no idea it was about to become the very thing that would blow their case apart forever. The prosecution pinned its hopes on a relatively new technology called YSTR testing. In simple terms, most DNA testing looks at markers across all of our chromosomes, but YSTR analysis is different. It exclusively targets the Y chromosome, which is only passed down from father to son. This makes it an incredibly powerful tool in SA cases, where a victim's DNA, which is overwhelmingly female, can make it difficult to isolate the small amount of male DNA present. YSTR testing acts like a magnet, pulling out only the male profile from the mixture. The DNA evidence, which was carefully preserved for nearly 2 decades, was sent to the lab. The prosecution, the defense, and the families held their breath. Everyone believed this test would finally provide a definitive answer. The prosecution was certain it would confirm the guilt of Scott and Springsteen. The test was a success. From the degraded, decades-old evidence, the lab was able to extract a partial male DNA profile. And then came the bombshell. The DNA profile did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Robert Springsteen, and further testing confirmed it didn't match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn either. The results were irrefutable. It was definitive physical proof that an unknown male, someone completely outside of the group of 4 men who'd been the focus of the investigation for a decade, was involved in the crime. The entire foundation of the state's case had just crumbled to dust. Faced with this new evidence, the prosecution's position was untenable. Their star evidence, the confessions, were already legally compromised. Now the only piece of physical evidence in the entire case not only failed to support their theory, but actively contradicted it, pointing to a complete stranger. They had nothing left. In 2009, the Travis County District Attorney's Office dropped all charges. After spending nearly 10 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott walked free. It was later revealed that 7 of the original jurors who had convicted them came forward to say they would have voted not guilty if the DNA evidence was available at the trials. Let's pause here for a moment. While this case involved 4 innocent murder victims, I don't think it can be understated that these 2 young men were also victims. They spent 10 years of their lives in prison for a crime they didn't commit. After being coerced to confess, they ended up fighting to prove their innocence for a decade. And although they were released in 2009, it's likely that many people still believed until last week that they were guilty. The resolution in this case hopefully will help them move forward as well as the girls' families. So the investigation was now back to square one. Not only did they have no idea who the killer was, but they now faced the horrifying reality that they spent a decade pursuing the wrong men, while the real killer's trail grew impossibly cold. The DNA was both an answer and a curse. And so the case was left with its biggest and most terrifying question yet. If it wasn't them, who was the unknown man in the yogurt shop that night? Who is this genetic ghost? For more than a decade after the exonerations, the case went cold again. The investigators compared the DNA to all other potential suspects with no matches. The ghost remained nameless. The families were left once again with no answers, but there were some glimmers of hope. In 2021, while there were still no leads on the case, the law around cold cases was changing as a direct result of the long unsolved murders at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. Representative Michael McCall from Texas introduced legislation to Congress, the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act of 2021. With some caveats, it gives families the right to petition the federal government for a case review if their loved one's case has gone cold after 3 years. President Biden signed this into law in August of 2022. Also in 2022, Detective Daniel Jackson took over the cold case. First, he submitted some of the shell casings to the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. When the results came in 2025, there was a cold case in Kentucky where shell casings likely fired from the same weapon were found. At the same time, Jackson reached out to all other labs who did YSTR DNA testing to see if they had any matches, and they found a match to a 1990 SA case in Greenville, South Carolina. And this time, there was a name attached. In September of 2025, less than 2 weeks ago at the time of this filming, and after 33 years of questions, the Austin Police Department announced a significant breakthrough. They finally put a name to the ghost. The DNA was a match for a man named Robert Eugene Brashers, and law enforcement officially named him as the suspect in the murders of Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, and Amy. As investigators looked into his past, the horrific truth of the yogurt shop murders finally began to take shape. Robert Brashers wasn't a troubled teenager. He was a prolific, transient serial killer and predator who at the time of the murders was already an experienced, violent adult in his early 30s and known for targeting women. His profile was a perfect match for the initial assessment made by the original detectives back in 1991, that the crime was the work of a controlled, experienced adult, not impulsive teenagers. His criminal history was a trail of terror that stretched across the country. In 1985, Brashers was convicted of shooting a woman in Florida. He only served 4 years of his 12-year sentence, which left him free to harm others. In 1990, a year before the Austin murders, he essayed and strangled 28-year-old Genevieve Zitricki in her South Carolina home. In 1997, he'd harmed a 14-year-old girl at gunpoint in Tennessee. Fortunately, she survived, but I can't imagine the trauma she faced in overcoming that horrific experience. And in 1998 in Missouri, Brashers murdered 38-year-old Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan, shooting them both with a .22 caliber gun. The details of his other crimes created chilling echoes with the evidence from the yogurt shop. The .22 caliber gun in the Scherer murders matched one of the two weapons used in Austin. In 1997 in Memphis, he actually committed a crime in a very similar way to the yogurt shop. By himself, he threatened 4 women, tied them up with their own clothing, and essayed one of them. His pattern of targeting young girls was also a behavioral match to the Austin crime scene. This DNA match wasn't just a coincidence. It was the key that unlocked a pattern of pure evil. But the revelation of the killer's identity came with one final bitter twist. Robert Eugene Brashers would never face justice for his crimes. He died in 1999 in January during a 4-hour standoff with police at a motel in Missouri. The real killer was already dead months before the Austin Police Department even arrested those 4 innocent young men. The entire decade-long miscarriage of justice, the trials, the convictions, the years spent in prison, all happened while the man responsible was already in his grave. So if he was dead in 1999, how did they connect Brashers to these cold cases? Genealogical DNA testing. After discovering that the DNA found at some of the other crime scenes was a familial match to Brashers' living relatives, his body was exhumed to see if he was an exact match. And sure enough, in 2018, they finally had his full DNA profile and have been matching him to cold cases around the country ever since. The final loop of the yogurt shop murders is now closed. We know who likely killed these girls, but there will be no trial, no day in court, no moments of accountability. The justice the families have waited 33 years for is, and always will be, incomplete. In fact, it comes with the sad knowledge that these deaths could have been prevented. If Brashers, who was a known violent offender, hadn't been released 8 years early, Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, Amy, and others might still be alive today. In a remarkable but courageous act, Brashers' own daughter Deborah, who was just an infant when the murders of the 4 Austin teens took place, and only 8 when her father died, came forward. Grappling with the horrific legacy of a man she barely knew, she offered the apology that he never would. Quote, "I'm very sorry to every family that my father hurt. Half of my DNA is the person that hurt you the most, so I want to tell you sorry, and I'm so sorry for everything, but I'm finally glad that you're getting answers." For former detective John Jones, it was the end of one of his most haunting cases. As he stood before reporters in September of 2025, he completed a promise. He wore that same ugly green shirt, one he hadn't worn in 34 years. To him, this case is finally solved. The yogurt shop murders were a tragedy that riveted a city and troubled the nation's conscience for decades. On one hand, they showed the worst of humanity, a vicious crime against 4 innocent girls, and the targeting of 2 innocent men who lost years of their lives due to law enforcement's tunnel vision. On the other hand, this case helped to bring about a law that will help families of victims petition for their loved ones' cases to be reviewed with new technology. This breakthrough also shows the best efforts of science and law enforcement to seek justice despite the passage of decades, which continues to give hope that other long, cold cases will be solved as well. In the end, what feels important isn't that the detectives finally got a suspect. It's that 4 families and a community have answers. It's that 2 innocent men have been 100% exonerated, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the minds of the public as well. Finally, I hope a new generation can learn from this case, to believe in science, to demand that justice is fair, and to never forget the faces behind the headlines. Even after 34 years, we see that justice can arrive, and that every victim and family deserves nothing less. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. As a small channel, viewers like you truly do make a massive difference in helping us get this. And if you're on TV, you can press up on your remote and swipe over to our channel icon. Thank you.